The day my first love returned to our small town.
All right, fam. The link in the description is calling your name. Go, go, go.
What is the weight of a decade when it is measured in gravel and rust? Desmond parked his battered truck in the lot of Miller's Hardware, the engine giving one final, shuddering cough before falling silent. He sat for a moment, his calloused hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the familiar grit of the small town he had tried to outrun. The air here was heavy with the scent of pine and oncoming rain, a sharp contrast to the sterile highways he usually inhabited. He had returned for a simple repair job on a fixer-upper near the creek, needing nothing more than a brass valve and perhaps a cold soda. As he stepped out, his leather boots crunched against the stones, and he adjusted the sleeves of his gray Henley. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life, a drifter who knew every backroad but no longer recognized the faces in the windows. The hardware store stood like a sentinel of his youth, its red paint peeling in long, jagged strips that looked like scars against the weathered wood. The bell above the door chimed with a tinny, nostalgic ring as Desmond stepped into the dim interior. He navigated the aisles by memory, passing the rows of galvanized nails and coils of yellow rope. He found the plumbing section, grabbed the necessary valve, and headed toward the front counter with the casual gait of a man who belonged nowhere. He reached for his retractable measuring tape, pulling it out to check a dimension on a nearby display one last time, the metallic zipping sound filling the quiet air. Just as he let the tape snap back toward its housing, a hand shot across the counter and caught the metal tab with impossible precision. Desmond froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked up and felt the world tilt on its axis. Standing behind the register was a woman with piercing silver eyes that held the moonlight of 1,000 memories. It was Cinder, the girl who had vanished from his life like smoke in a gale, leaving him with a hollow chest and a suitcase that never stayed shut. She didn't look like the teenager he remembered, yet she was unmistakable. Her posture was regal, her shoulders set with a commanding grace that made the cramped store feel like a palace. Cinder's gaze locked onto his, a playful, knowing glint dancing in those metallic orbs. She didn't release the measuring tape. Instead, she held it firmly with a dark, sharp claw that extended from the tip of her finger, pressing the metal against the wood of the counter. Desmond felt his throat go dry, his mind racing through a dozen questions that all died before they could reach his lips. Her presence was magnetic, an effortless power that seemed to pull the very air toward her. She looked at him as if they had only spoken yesterday, her expression a mix of feline mischief and the heavy weight of secrets. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was a living thing, vibrating with the echoes of every word they had never gotten to say. Cinder leaned forward, her face coming within inches of his, and the scent of wild sage and cold earth drifted from her. A slow, lopsided grin spread across her face, revealing a glimpse of teeth that were just a bit too sharp to be entirely human. "You always did have a habit of letting things slip through your fingers, Desmond," she said, her voice a rich contralto that vibrated in the marrow of his bones. He finally found his breath, his hand still hovering near the tape she held captive. "I thought you were a ghost," he managed to whisper, his voice rough with a decade of disuse. Cinder let out a soft, melodic laugh that sounded like water rushing over smooth stones. "Ghosts don't buy hardware, Des. They just haunt the aisles." She retracted her claw, the metal tape finally snapping back into its plastic casing with a sharp click. Her eyes searched his face, tracing the lines of his jaw and the weariness around his eyes, finding the boy he used to be hidden beneath the rugged exterior of the man he had become. The moment was shattered by the heavy tread of boots coming from the back office. Nathan, the shop owner, emerged with a clipboard tucked under his arm, his face etched with a frown that deepened when he saw Desmond. He was a man who moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who had seen too many seasons change. "Glad you finally made it in, Desmond, but you picked a hell of a day to come back to town," Nathan grunted, leaning his elbows on the counter and glancing nervously toward the front window. Desmond frowned, sensing a shift in the atmosphere that had nothing to do with his reunion with Cinder. "What's going on, Nathan? You look like you're waiting for a storm to break." Nathan lowered his voice, his eyes darting toward the street. There are 3 black SUVs patrolling the outskirts. Tinted windows, no plates, and men inside who look like they're hunting for more than just deer. They've been circling the block for an hour. Desmond glanced at Cinder, noticing for the first time the way she stiffened at Nathan's words. Her regal composure didn't break, but her silver eyes narrowed, flashing with a predatory intensity that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. She reached up to adjust the collar of her emerald green sweater, a subtle movement that revealed a glimpse of thick, charcoal gray fur along the curve of her neck. She tried to tuck the wild growth back under the fabric, her movements precise and practiced, but the secret was out. Desmond felt a cold realization wash over him. The tension in the town, the mysterious vehicles, and the strange, beautiful transformation of his first love were all interconnected. Cinder wasn't just back. She was a fugitive, a queen out of her element, hiding in plain sight behind a hardware counter while the world outside closed in on her. The weight of the situation settled into his shoulders, replacing his nostalgia with a sharp, protective instinct. He looked from Nathan's worried face back to Cinder, who was watching him with a defiant tilt of her chin. She wasn't asking for help, but he could see the flicker of vulnerability behind the silver mask of her eyes. If those trucks are looking for someone, they aren't going to stop at the town limits, Desmond said, his voice low and steady. He felt the familiar itch to run, to climb back into his truck and disappear into the horizon, but his feet felt rooted to the floorboards. For the first time in 15 years, he had found something worth staying for, even if it meant stepping into the path of a predator. Nathan sighed, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "Just be careful, kid. This town isn't as quiet as it used to be, and some people don't like it when things from the woods start walking the streets." Cinder reached out, her hand momentarily brushing against Desmond's forearm. The touch was warm, pulsing with a vitality that felt like a lightning strike. Her skin was soft, but the muscle beneath was like coiled steel. "We should talk," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the overhead lights. "Not here. Not with eyes on the glass." Desmond nodded, his mind already mapping out the back alleys and the shadowed paths he used to trek as a boy. He took the brass valve from the counter, but his thoughts were entirely on the woman standing before him. The playful spark they had shared moments ago was now tempered by the reality of the hunt. He realized that the drifter's life he had cultivated was about to end, one way or another. He wasn't just a handyman anymore. He was a man standing on the edge of a precipice, looking into the silver eyes of a wolf and deciding if he was brave enough to jump. The evening air turned brittle as Desmond led Cinder toward the porch of the dilapidated house on the edge of the creek. The structure was a skeletal remains of a Victorian dream, but the wide wooden deck offered a vantage point over the valley. They sat on the edge of the weathered planks, their legs dangling into the darkness, while a pale moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the overgrown lawn. Desmond leaned back on his elbows, his eyes tracking a firefly that flickered like a dying ember. "It feels like a lifetime since we sat like this," he remarked, the wood groaning softly beneath his weight. Cinder pulled her knees to her chest, the emerald wool of her sweater stretching over her powerful frame. She looked out at the tree line with a gaze that seemed to pierce the very fabric of the night. "We never had a choice back then, Des," she whispered, her voice thick with a decade of suppressed grief. "My father saw the black vans before they even reached the driveway. We didn't leave because we wanted to go. We fled because the alternative was a cage in some subterranean lab. They want our blood, our strength, and the way we connect to the earth. To them, we are just assets to be cataloged." Desmond felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach as he realized the magnitude of the burden she had carried while he was merely drifting from town to town. He reached out, his fingers brushing the coarse, beautiful fur on her forearm, marveling at the warmth radiating from her skin. Before he could offer a word of comfort, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway signaled an arrival. Nathan stepped out of the shadows, his face illuminated by the dim orange glow of a flashlight. He looked older than he had that morning, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his conscience. "Desmond, we have a problem," Nathan said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried over the wind. "The sheriff just called. Some suits from the city are leaning on him hard. They're offering a bounty for any reports of strangers or people with unusual physical traits. He's holding them off for now, but he can't ignore a federal warrant if they produce one." Nathan's eyes flickered to Cinder, filled with a mixture of fear and a lingering sense of small-town loyalty. A sudden, high-pitched whirring sound cut through the quiet of the porch. Desmond's head snapped up, his handyman's ears identifying the mechanical pitch of a drone. He spotted the small, blinking red light hovering near the oak trees at the edge of the property, its camera lens swiveling toward their position. Without a word, he lunged forward, grabbing Cinder's hand and pulling her into the pitch-black interior of the unfinished house. They pressed themselves against the raw plywood walls, the scent of sawdust and insulation filling their lungs. Desmond held his breath, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs as the drone buzzed past the open window frame, a predatory insect searching for a meal. Cinder's hand was a vice around his, her claws digging slightly into his palm, not out of aggression but out of a reflexive need for an anchor. The red light faded as the machine drifted toward the creek, leaving them in a silence so thick it felt like velvet. Cinder leaned her head against the studding of the wall, her silver eyes glowing with a faint, bioluminescent intensity in the dark. "I'm the last of the pureblood line in this region," she confessed, her breath hitching. "If they take me, they get the map to every hidden sanctuary my people have left. My capture wouldn't just be my end, it would be the extinction of our freedom. I came back here hoping the old stories were true, that this town was a place where a person could get lost in the folds of the map." Desmond looked at her, seeing not a monster or a miracle, but a woman who had been hunted her entire life. He thought of his truck, his tools, and the empty road that had been his only companion for 15 years. For the first time, the idea of leaving felt like a betrayal rather than an escape. "I'm not letting them touch you, Cinder," he promised, the words feeling like a vow etched into the very foundation of the house. The next morning, the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Desmond returned to the hardware store to gather supplies, hopping to maintain the illusion of a normal workday. As he was browsing the aisle for heavy-duty zip ties and flares, a woman in a sharp, charcoal-gray tactical vest entered the store. She moved with a calculated precision that screamed military training. This was Ophelia, a lead operative for the tracking team. She didn't look at the tools, she looked at the people. She approached the counter where Desmond stood and slid a ruggedized tablet across the scuffed wood. "Seen anyone like this?" she asked, her voice as cold as a mountain stream. The screen displayed a high-resolution thermal image of a wolf-like figure and a digital bounty figure that made Desmond's head swim. "It's a wild specimen, highly dangerous," Ophelia added, her eyes scanning Desmond's face for any sign of a lie. "We're doing a full sweep of the old lumber yard at midnight. If you're smart, you'll stay indoors." Desmond forced a dull, vacant expression onto his face, the kind he had used 1,000 times to avoid conversation at roadside diners. "Can't say I have, ma'am," he drawled, leaning heavily against the counter. "I'm just here to fix a leaky roof before the rain hits. Mostly I just see squirrels and the occasional stray dog." Ophelia studied him for a long beat, her gaze lingering on his calloused hands and the grease stains on his Henley. She seemed satisfied that he was nothing more than a local laborer, a bit of background noise in her high-stakes hunt. She retrieved her tablet and marched out of the store, her boots clicking with a lethal rhythm. As soon as the door swung shut, Desmond felt the adrenaline hit his system. He knew their schedule now. He had a window of opportunity, but it was closing fast. He needed to find Cinder and prepare her for the coming storm. He found her in the storage room at the back of the store, tucked between crates of winter salt and rolls of fencing. The moment their eyes met, the pretense of the hardware store vanished. Cinder stepped into his space, her presence overwhelming the cramped room. Desmond didn't hesitate. He pulled her into a fierce embrace, his arms wrapping around her emerald sweater while her face buried into the crook of his neck. The scent of her, the wild, untamed essence of the forest, swirled around him, grounding him in a way the highway never could. "I can't lose you again," he whispered into her hair, his voice cracking. "I spent 10 years wondering where you went, and I won't spend another 10 knowing exactly where they took you." Cinder pulled back just enough to look him in the eye, her silver gaze searching his soul. "You'd risk everything for me. This town finally took you back, Des. You have a home here now." He shook his head, a grim smile touching his lips. "It's not a home if you're not in it." But the world outside the store was already turning against them. As they emerged from the back, they saw Nathan standing by the window, watching a group of townspeople gathered on the sidewalk. They were whispering, pointing toward the back of the building where Desmond's truck was parked. Nathan turned to them, his expression grim. "People are talking, Desmond. They saw you with her at the old house. They're scared, and scared people do desperate things to protect their own peace. If you keep hiding her, this town is going to tear you apart before the trackers even get a chance. You're throwing away your reputation, your future, everything you worked for to come back here. Is she worth becoming an outlaw for?" Nathan's question hung in the air like a heavy fog, demanding an answer that would change the course of Desmond's life forever. Desmond looked at the door, then back at Cinder, who stood with her head held high, a queen awaiting her fate. He reached into his pocket and felt the cold steel of his truck keys. He knew what he had to do. The lumber yard sweep was the key. If he could lead Ophelia and her team on a wild goose chase through the jagged remains of the old mill, he could buy Cinder enough time to reach the hidden camp in the mountains. It meant burning every bridge he had just rebuilt. It meant the people who had welcomed him back with open arms would soon view him as a traitor. He didn't care. He looked at Cinder and saw the only truth that mattered in a world of shifting shadows. "I'm going to lead them away," he said, his voice hard and certain. "I'll make a trail they can't resist following. You head for the ridge. I'll meet you at the old ranger station at dawn." Cinder reached out, her clawed fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw, a silent promise of a future they would have to fight to claim. The plan solidified in Desmond's mind with the cold, sharp precision of a blueprint. He left Cinder at the edge of the woods and drove straight to the local tavern, knowing Ophelia's scouts were embedded there like ticks. He didn't hide his movements. Instead, he made a show of checking his watch and whispering urgently into his phone about the narrow canyon by the old mill, loud enough for a nearby operative to catch the coordinates. He watched through his rearview mirror as the charcoal-gray tactical vehicles peeled away from the curb, their engines growling as they took the bait. The deception felt like a physical weight, a heavy cloak he was draping over the town he had once called home, but the thought of Cinder's silver eyes behind a cage door made the betrayal easy to swallow. He steered his truck toward the lumber yard, the tires spitting gravel as he prepared to cut the final ties to his old life. The rusted gates of the lumber yard groaned as Desmond swung them shut, only to find Nathan standing in the center of the yard, illuminated by the pale, pre-dawn light. The older man's face was a mask of disappointment, his arms crossed over his chest as he looked at the man he had treated like a son. "You're leading them on a chase, Desmond," Nathan said, his voice thick with a bitterness that stung more than any physical blow. "I thought you were back for good, that you were one of us again, but you're just another drifter playing games with federal agents. You're going to bring the whole mountain down on this town just to save a girl who should have stayed a memory." Desmond didn't blink, his grip tightening on a heavy iron pry bar. "I'm saving a life, Nathan, and if that makes me an outlaw in your eyes, then I guess I never really belonged here to begin with." The sound of screeching tires interrupted their standoff, as the first of the tracking vehicles realized the canyon was a dead end and swung back toward the yard. Desmond ignored Nathan's scowl and sprinted toward the shadows where the pursuit SUVs were beginning to congregate. He moved with the practiced stealth of a man who knew every loose floorboard and hidden crevice of the industrial ruins. Using a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters and a handful of roofing nails, he went to work on the lead vehicle's undercarriage. He felt the cold transmission fluid drip onto his knuckles as he severed the cooling lines, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't just fixing a machine this time. He was dismantling a trap. Each snip of the pliers felt like a bridge burning behind him, a definitive end to the quiet life he had briefly imagined for himself in the hardware store. Ophelia stepped out of the second vehicle, her boots crunching on the sawdust-covered ground with predatory intent. She didn't look surprised to see Desmond standing there, his hands stained with oil and his eyes defiant. "You had a chance to be a hero, Mr. Handyman," she said, her hand resting on the holster at her hip as her team fanned out behind her. "You could have taken the bounty and bought this whole town, but instead, you're throwing your life away for a specimen that doesn't even belong in your world." She took a step forward, the moonlight catching the hard edge of her jaw. "Tell me where she is, and maybe I can convince the sheriff to forget you were ever involved in this." Desmond just smiled, a slow, dangerous expression that had nothing to do with his usual lopsided grin. "You're looking for a queen, Ophelia, but all you're going to find is dust." Desmond threw a handful of magnesium flares into the dry timber piles and dived into his truck, flooring the accelerator before the first spark even caught. The tracking team scrambled, their engines sputtering and dying as the sabotage took hold, but Ophelia's personal vehicle roared to life, having escaped his tools. He led her on a frantic, high-speed chase toward the outskirts of town, the headlights of his old truck cutting through the morning mist. He pushed the engine until the dashboard vibrated, drawing the pursuit further and further away from the mountain trails where the rest of Cinder's people were hidden. The world became a blur of dark pines and gray asphalt, a desperate race against the rising sun that threatened to expose everything they were trying to protect. As they reached the rocky pass that marked the town limits, a massive shadow detached itself from the tree line. Cinder didn't hide this time. She leapt onto the hood of Ophelia's moving SUV with the force of a falling star. Her gray fur was a blur of motion, her silver eyes burning with a regal fury that paralyzed the driver. With one powerful swipe of her clawed hand, she shattered the reinforced windshield, not to kill, but to command. She stood atop the stalled vehicle, her posture upright and commanding, looking down at the terrified agents with the cold dignity of a monarch. She wasn't a beast to be catalogued. She was a force of nature that demanded their retreat. The trackers froze, their high-tech equipment suddenly looking like children's toys in the presence of something so ancient and unyielding. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of cooling engines. Nathan's truck pulled up behind them, the headlights illuminating the scene like a stage. He stepped out, looking at Cinder in her true form, then at Desmond, who was breathing hard against the side of his truck. For a long minute, no one spoke. Nathan looked toward the town, then back at the woman who had once been a girl in a hardware store. "Go," Nathan muttered, his voice barely a whisper as he turned to face Ophelia and her stunned team. "I'll tell them you went over the cliff. I'll tell them the specimen was lost in the river. Just get out of here before the sun is high enough for everyone else to see." He gave Desmond a short, sharp nod, a final blessing from a man who understood that some loyalties were deeper than geography. The agents began to retreat, their broken vehicles being towed back toward the city as the mystery of the pureblood became a failed report in a dusty file. Desmond watched them go, feeling the weight of his reputation as a local hero dissolve into the morning air. He was no longer the handyman who had come home to fix a roof. He was a ghost, a man whose name would be whispered in the tavern as a cautionary tale. He didn't mind the loss. He turned to see Cinder standing by the passenger door of his truck, her fur receding back into the emerald sweater, her silver eyes softening as she looked at him. She didn't need to say thank you. The way she held out her hand, palm up and waiting, was enough of a promise for a lifetime of wandering. Desmond climbed into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of old leather and sawdust surrounding him. He looked at the toolbox in the back, then at the woman beside him, and realized that for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't drifting. He was moving toward a destination that didn't appear on any map. He shifted the truck into gear and pulled away from the town limits, leaving the hardware store and the unfinished Victorian house behind in the rearview mirror. The road ahead was unpaved and unpredictable, winding deep into the heart of the wilderness where the rules of men didn't apply. As the first rays of the sun hit the windshield, he reached over and took Cinder's hand, his calloused fingers locking with hers as they drove together into the wild unknown.